It's a Sunday afternoon in Moscow, and here on Red Square, thousands of tourists from all parts of the USSR and from other nations are acting like tourists anywhere in the world, going in and taking a peek inside the Kremlin walls. We find detachments of troops lined up, having their pictures taken, posing before the Kremlin Wall and St. Basil's Cathedral.
Совершенно верно. Строительство крупнопанельное, крупносборочное ведется по предварительно заготовленным на заводах сборным конструкциям.
This is Russia, a special documentary presented by the 400 food fair stores serving millions of Americans throughout our country.
Good evening. This is Ralph Renick. Why make a journey to Russia? Our country is pitted in a very real life or death struggle with the Soviet Union. Churchill once described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Russia and communism are things we know too little about. To fight something, you've got to know what you're battling. And thus a trip to Russia might do some good in this regard. At least it could do little harm. With the thought that others in South Florida might feel the same way, I invited a group of South Florida business and professional men to join me on a tour behind the Iron Curtain. 46 of us traveled some 20,000 miles on the journey. This program tonight is a report on what we saw, what we did, and some conclusions as to what all of us can do as Americans to win this battle for survival. I would like to emphasize at the outset that it would be folly to pose as any sort of expert on anything based on 2 weeks behind the Iron Curtain. This is merely a report on the situation as we saw it. With that understanding, here now is tonight's program, This is Russia. First, let's take a look back in history in order to put today's Russia in proper perspective. These scenes were taken in 1917, just about 40 years ago. But conditions then were markedly different from today. The Tsar and the nobility ruled, owned, and controlled. We are somewhat surprised to see Russian women working today, but as you see, it's an old story with us. In 1917, Tsar Nicholas II found himself faced with a two-pronged dilemma. His armies were being crushed by the Germans, and the poverty-stricken serfs were rebelling. The peasants' reason for moving to overthrow the Tsar was based more on hunger than on any high-sounding philosophy of Marx or Lenin. While the masses went hungry, the Tsar and his family enjoyed such pleasant pastimes as a gentle game of soccer. Or the more exhilarating sport of swimming without benefit of bathing suits. Finally, the army deserted the Tsar, and Nicholas was forced to abdicate. This left the field open to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who rode into power on the hungry stomachs of the deceived peasants and serfs. Thus, the transition to communism occurred. In just 40 years, Russia has risen to become the second strongest military and industrial power in the world. Today, the people are not starving for food, but we shall learn that their diet of life is very lean in many other aspects, notably personal freedom. This is Leningrad today, the Russian version of Flagler Street. They call it the Nevsky Prospect. These are the sounds of Leningrad. The people look and act like dwellers in any big city. The people here express active curiosity toward our trip to Russia. Dr. Thomas Carney talked to one of them.
No, this is just a goodwill tour that we're having from Miami, Florida, to the people of Russia, to let them know what we look like and to find out what they look like. And I know a lot of the people here don't understand, and if you would tell them what what we are doing here, just to take pictures to show our people that all the children look to be the same, and the children are mostly the same the world over.
Why do you not have the interpreter?
No, we had an interpreter this morning, but we didn't feel as if we wanted an interpreter this afternoon because we did not want to speak to the people directly. Just take their pictures and look at their reactions, the same as we have at home.
The people we saw everywhere were curious. Of course, we were equally curious. The Russians enabled persons in our group to visit and talk with their counterparts. For example, two pharmacists, John Stednick and Samuel Jackson, visit this drugstore. They learn the Russians are starting to use tranquilizers in large quantities. Very little pharmaceutical research is done. But when a drug is produced in another country, the Russians waste no time in obtaining the formula. Drugs are government-made. There's no advertising, no false claims. In Russia, an aspirin's an aspirin. In a related field now, let's take a look at a hospital in Moscow. Hospitals are badly overcrowded. One reason for this is free medical care. At the hospital, photographer Lynn took advantage of that free care when he had a cinder removed from his eye. He offered to pay, but it was on the house. Following this minor operation, the chief surgeon explained that women doctors outnumber men doctors in Russia 4 to 1. He told Dr. George Boucher there are two reasons for this. First, there are 17 million more women than men in the 30 to 45-year-old age bracket because of high World War II casualties. Secondly, doctors' pay is quite low, starting salary about $1,200 a year, and a good surgeon can look forward to only about $3,000 annually. Qualified men become scientists and engineers who can earn up to 4 times as much. Dr. Boucher, Dr. Carney, and others in our group put on surgical gowns and observed an intestinal operation for cancer. They noted the techniques were excellent in spite of the antiquated condition of the hospital building. It's about 25 to 30 years behind American hospital structures, not as sanitary either. The equipment, though, is good. One Russian official boasted that in Moscow alone last year, they spent $45 million on hospital operating costs. The figure sounds high unless you happen to know that a single hospital in New York City alone spent 3 times as much. Here is a factory in Leningrad. This plant manufactures electronic equipment. There's a regulation in Russia prohibiting the taking of photographs in factories. My camera was left at the door. Later, the manager proclaimed there was no iron curtain separating Russia from the West. I asked the manager if I might be allowed, thusly, to retrieve my camera and take pictures for this program. This, I told him, would be partial evidence to an American audience that maybe no restrictive iron curtain existed. I got the camera. Here are the results. This plant was built in 1913. It's old-looking, but inside, some 10,000 workers use assembly line techniques in turning out transistor tubes and other products. This is the manager who permitted the pictures to be taken. He said there are no strikes in the plant because it is owned by the state, which is the people. So he said the workers would in effect be striking against themselves. Most employees work 7 hours a day, 6 days a week. Those workers who handle dangerous chemicals get a break. They work 1 hour less each day and are given free milk and lunch. In a park across the street from the factory, the women employees take a 40-minute lunch break. They utilize the weather to get some sun. The use of slogans, placing on bulletin boards of workers' pictures who exceed their output quotas, gives the employees incentive to produce more. The machines used in the plant were mostly Russian-made, according to George Brumlick, who said there were some old-style U.S. machines used also. Any worker absent without good reason appears before a court of his fellow workers, and punishment is handed out. In this system, one citizen is a spy on the activities of his neighbor. In stark contrast to that factory is this 3,000-acre state experimental farm outside Moscow. Dairyman J.N. MacArthur reports that Russian farms and farming methods are not as efficient as is Soviet industry. 50% of all Russians work on farms in comparison with the American figure of 10% of the population. Women do a great deal of the work simply because there aren't enough men to go around. The workers are untrained. These are workers' houses. MacArthur says the cattle looked good on this farm, but the crop's poor. There's plenty of land in the Soviet Union that's uncultivated. The country is land rich and labor poor. The emphasis in Russia now is on industry. As an example of this, last year, Russia bought $100 million worth of grain and wheat from Argentina and used heavy machinery as payment. There are rigid rules about workers' quotas on farms. They must be met each year. In her self-proclaimed race for the United States, Russia freely admits that farming is one of her slack spots. But now Premier Khrushchev says he will give farming more attention. In the smaller farms, one half of the produce is turned over to the state. The rest can be sold by the farmer. And so, free enterprise in the Soviet Union is not completely dead. The supermarket is non-existent in Russia. This is a typical market in Moscow. The farmer rents stall space. Restaurateur Art Bruns noted that everything is sold by the pound. Chicken, $1 a pound, with feet and entrails extra. Dried apples, 60 cents a pound. Radishes, $1. Inferior grade meat, $1.40 a pound. Lemons, 25 cents apiece. Oranges, 40 cents each. There are no paper bags, and what's worse, by the American housewife's standards, there are no sale items. The Russian citizen works hard. His life is regimented. Does he have any fun? This is a beach at Leningrad, practically downtown, located across the river from the Winter Palace of the Tsars, the focal point during the Bolshevik Revolution. This beach, from the appearance of the brief bathing suits, resembles the French Riviera more than Russia, where we are used to seeing people overclothed because of the cold weather most of the year. But on this day, the temperatures were in the upper 70s. The sun worshippers were out in force. Most of the people were young teenage couples, a few parents with their children. The sand was littered with debris. Although we were here without any interpreter, the sunbathers gave us a warm reception. The beach is for the daytime, but those people who have only evenings for entertainment go to the puppet show. You're looking at one now in Moscow. They also go to the ballet and concerts and circuses and to the movies. This unusual structural steel design is a television transmission tower. Moscow has 2 channels. Programs for both outlets come from the same studio building. All shows are produced by the state-owned TV facility. During the week, you can watch TV from 7 until 11 p.m. Physical culture shows, concerts, ballet, puppet shows, such as this one about a cat bookseller, our favorite. The man behind the desk is Nikolai Chapligin, head of broadcasting in Moscow. He told me there are 1,300,000 sets within range of the Russian capital. He also said the cheapest small screen set costs $200. A 14-inch screen sells for $850. Color television is just coming to Russia. 1,200 people work in TV alone in Moscow. There are 57 similar program centers in the Soviet Union. It was interesting to note that TV news shows contained mostly propaganda material. There were no spot news stories, no items about crime or government. It was like an Alice in Wonderland presentation. For those children too young to enjoy television, there are many parks scattered throughout Russia. The modern baby carriages and warm clothing indicates the importance the Soviets place upon the welfare of the younger generation. The parks also attract many young office workers, not all of whom are as playful as these two Moscow lovers. Throughout our entire stay in Russia, we encountered only one drunk. Or perhaps he was an unusually exuberant Muscovite. When a child is born to parents in Russia, the mother can either stop working or take a 2-month vacation with pay and then return to her job. Most women return to work because it takes the combined income of husband and wife to pay for the necessities of life. Thus, the children are turned over to the state when babies. As they become older and attend state schools, they join the Young Pioneers. The next step is the Young Communist League, and finally, entrance into the Communist Party, the latter being an honor. Only about 3% of the USSR total population is made up of Communist Party members. But these youngsters, with their pliable minds, are being trained as the state dictates. Is there anything comparable to justice in Russia? Several lawyers and Dade Circuit Judge George Holt went to a people's court to find out. There is one such court for each 30,000 population. In Leningrad, there are 127 such courts with both civil and criminal jurisdiction. But only the district court and Supreme Court are empowered to hand down the death penalty. The judge seen here of this lower court sits on the bench with two people's accessories, which make it a 3-judge tribunal. The judge here explains that some cases he hears are divorce, desertion of a family, and appeals from workers who are dismissed from their jobs. Attorney William Gaither was told that when a person is arrested, the state must accuse him within 48 hours. The arrested party may be held in jail for 1 month while the case is investigated. But if more time is needed, the prosecutor may ask the court to prolong the detention up to 6 months. While in jail, a person cannot have a defense attorney until the investigation is completed. There is no habeas corpus, and political crimes make it particularly rough on an individual. You're looking at the sprawling city of Moscow. Wide streets, few cars, many, many trucks. There are 7 skyscrapers here, including Moscow University, a hotel and apartment house seen there. But the Russians say they will build no more such structures. They are too impractical and expensive. Instead, construction design today provides no more than 8 stories. Those are apartments. This project features prefab wall sections. We'll talk with the project engineer, the man responsible for this construction and those prefabricated sections. How long does it take you to construct one of these apartment housing units?
Сколько времени потребуется для того, чтобы построить такое здание?
Для того, чтобы построить такой дом, нужно 3,5 месяца.
In order to build a building like that, it takes 3.5 months.
Architect Robert Little noted there seemed to be very few skilled mechanics working on such projects. Again, most of the workers were women. Since there's no need to provide off-street parking because of the lack of cars, there's plenty of playground space for children around the apartment. There's Dr. Pearson, president of the University of Miami, with Jose Ferre. The Russian children, like American children, are great do-it-yourself addicts. They, too, realize the play value of a good, sloppy, old-fashioned mud pie. While touring this area, we received a rare invitation from a Russian family to visit their apartment. Small but adequate, an old-fashioned stove next to an up-to-date stainless steel sink. The large family was friendly and didn't seem to mind the crowded conditions. They, like other Soviet citizens, feel it's a temporary situation. Things will get better. They're not distressed by the poor construction, although they are aware of it and realize they can do better. This new building is, by our standards, crudely constructed. But the big objective now in Russia is just to throw up shelter. The Russians are just now realizing, too, the value of a shopping center rather than scattering stores throughout a housing project. Architect Little says there was practically no steel used in this construction because of a shortage of that product. There were slums to be seen. The Russian citizen, though, does his best to prevent photographers from taking pictures here, apparently fearful that we will work the same propaganda trick with such pictures as the Russians do with U.S. slum pictures. And here's another view of the slums. What about hotels in Russia? This, for example, is my room in Leningrad. It was a suite that would have done even the Tsars proud. Here's the sitting room at the end of the entrance hall. Figurines, pottery, and paintings adorned the room. All the art objects had metal tag numbers attached to them with wire. Apparently a careful inventory check was kept. The beds were rather hard, but comfortable, with 2 pillows and a quilt. Telephone service was unwieldy because of the language problem. There were double windows to keep out the winter cold. You could use the phone for room service, but you couldn't depend on speed. It took 15 minutes for the water to drain from this wash basin. Small cakes of soap were provided, as were drain stoppers, contrary to reports we heard prior to the trip. The bathtubs were large. A portable shower nozzle was attached to a hose. The hot water just wasn't hot. There was a trickle of warm water. This 5-room corner suite even had a study, which came in handy for typing and compiling notes and shooting scripts. Remember, though, that this suite was the best to be had in Leningrad. The average hotel rooms provided are adequate, but not as fancy. We saw no new hotels being built. Some of the reading material available in English here at the hotel. Here's the Daily Worker, the United States edition, which is distributed in Russia. And the big stories here are in great detail. First, the story of the mutilation of the Negro lynching victim in Mississippi, and also a story of the strike at the textile mill in Henderson, North Carolina. The entire newspaper is filled with similar material of this type, all anti-United States and pro-communist. There's an English-speaking newspaper published in Moscow called the Moscow News, and this is not quite so vehement against the United States, but merely outlines news of Russian activities and Russian officials in the continuing East-West conflict. While in Russia, the visitor is in the hands of Intourist, the government agency which handles all travel, lodging, and sightseeing arrangements. The visitor gets a financial break. He receives 10 rubles for each American dollar. The official rate of exchange is 4 rubles to the dollar. And so a dollar buys actually 2.5 times more than the value received by the Russian citizen. But even so, things are not too cheap. The most inexpensive things I found were this doll. It sold for $1. And there was another type of doll you might be interested in, a wooden one which breaks apart into a series of smaller dolls. This also sold for $1. And these are Russian cigarettes. They are really half tobacco and half a long smokestack type of filter. If your doctor tells you to stay away from tobacco, these might be just the thing. The actual cigarette is only about 1 inch long. A 2-inch chamber keeps it away from your mouth.